Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to tell you a story about a young father who found himself in the middle of an unexpected showdown inside a post office. It began with nothing more than the sound of a newborn crying, a slow-moving line, and a man who thought he could humiliate a parent in front of strangers. But by the end of that day, the entire room turned against him and he left in shame. Now you might be wondering, how could something so ordinary explode into such drama? How could one quick response flip the balance of power in a crowded room? Well, stay with me, because this story is not just about a baby crying. It's about words, wit, and a bit of acting. And it all began back in 2012, when that father was standing in line at his local post office, rocking his tiny 1-month-old son in his arms. The post office on that morning was filled with the quiet shuffle of people waiting, the steady clicking of shoes against the old tiled floor, and the faint smell of paper, ink, and dust that always seemed to linger in such places. The kind of air that felt heavy, as though time itself moved slower whenever you stood in that line. There were around 10 people queued up, each holding their parcels, their envelopes, their thoughts, and right in the middle stood a young father, rocking his tiny 1-month-old son, who let out restless cries that echoed softly yet sharply against the walls, piercing through the stillness of the room. It was the kind of cry that instantly tugged at the nerves, a fragile sound, high-pitched and desperate, a reminder of how small and helpless a newborn truly is. The father's arms ached a little from holding his child, but he pressed the baby gently against his chest, feeling the warmth, the quick shallow breaths, the small fists curling and uncurling. And though tired, he carried in his eyes a quiet determination, because he knew his wife deserved a moment of rest at home. After weeks of sleepless nights, after countless hours of soothing a fragile life into calm, and he thought that by taking his son into town, he was giving her that rare gift of silence, of stillness, of sleep. Behind him, however, was a man, perhaps in his 40s, broad-shouldered, his face marked by impatience, his every sigh slicing through the air like a dull knife. He clicked his tongue loudly, shifted his weight, tapped his foot, shook his head in theatrical disapproval. His irritation was no longer private but performed for the whole line to see, until at last, in a voice louder than necessary, he spat out the words, sharp, cruel, and careless, asking why the child had not simply been left with his mother, mocking the father for not being able to handle his own baby. The words hung in the air like a foul odor, heavy, suffocating, impossible to ignore. The father turned, his eyes soft yet steady, and with a voice low but laced with apology, he explained, saying his son was only a newborn, tired, cranky, and that he was sorry for the noise. He hoped the man would accept that, let the moment pass, let the tension dissolve. But instead, the man pressed further, his tone sharper, his arrogance swelling, declaring that if the father was going to be terrible at caring for his child, he should have left the baby with his mother. And in that instant, the young father felt something shift, a spark igniting behind his calm exterior, a mixture of anger, hurt, and a strange sense of theater. He looked at the man, studied his face, the smugness, the disdain, and then, with a sudden surge of instinct, he decided to act, to turn the weight of the crowd, the silent eyes of strangers, into his shield. He put on a mask of sorrow, his expression sinking into grief, his voice trembling with a carefully crafted pain, and he said, loudly enough for every ear in the line to catch, that the baby's mother had passed away during childbirth, that she had been the one who read the parenting books, who knew how to comfort, who knew how to soothe, and now she was gone, leaving him broken and unsure, doing his best in a world that suddenly felt unbearably heavy. The words spilled like stones into the silence, and for a moment, time froze. The man behind him went pale, his smug face draining of color, his body stiff as if struck by lightning. The air shifted. The room itself seemed to turn against him, for now the strangers in line, the elderly woman clutching a small parcel, the young student balancing letters, the middle-aged man in a suit, all of them turned their eyes on him. Sharp, condemning, filled with outrage, they told him off, scolded him, ordered him to keep quiet, to respect the father, to mind his own business, their voices rising like a tide of anger, a chorus of judgment. And in the middle of it all, the young father kept his sad act alive, lowering his gaze, rocking his son gently, letting the pity grow, letting the shame settle on the man who had dared to speak so cruelly. And soon enough that man, now crushed beneath the stares, the whispers, the scolding voices, turned and left the queue, pushed out not by force but by the invisible weight of collective disapproval, leaving behind an air of silence that felt strangely victorious. And maybe now you can imagine the silence in that room, the way every single person shifted their attention, not to the crying baby, not to the father, but to the man who had spoken out of turn. The man who suddenly looked so small in a space that just moments ago seemed to belong to him. It was a moment heavy with tension, but also strangely satisfying. And let me ask you, have you ever witnessed something like this? A scene where one person's cruelty is suddenly exposed, where the weight of the crowd falls upon them, pressing them down, making them wish they could disappear. Think about it. How quickly the mood of a room can change. How fragile that balance of power is when strangers stand together in silence, then shift to unity. The father, still rocking his baby, felt the eyes of the others soften toward him, their voices no longer sharp but warm, protective, sympathetic, and they began to murmur words of comfort, telling him he was strong, telling him to take his time, even offering to let him move ahead in the line, because after all, who would not want to ease the burden of a man who had just lost the mother of his child? And let me ask you again, if you were standing there, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have defended him? Or would you have stayed silent, letting others carry the weight of the confrontation? The young father, of course, knew the truth, and perhaps you feel the tension of that truth as well, because behind the mask of grief, behind the trembling words, there was a quiet calculation, a spark of cleverness, a little act performed not out of malice but out of the desire to teach a lesson, to make sure that arrogant man would never again judge a parent struggling with a crying baby. And tell me, do you think he was right to do that? Was it fair to play on the sympathy of strangers? Or was it simply justice served in the only way possible at that moment? The baby by then had settled a little, his tiny face pressed against his father's shirt, his cries fading into soft whimpers, and the father stood there with a mixture of guilt and triumph swirling in his chest. guilt because he knew he was weaving a lie, but triumph because the man who had tried to shame him had now been shamed himself. And don't we all sometimes wish we could flip the script like that, to turn the weight of the world back onto someone who dares to throw cruelty our way? And so, the story ended with the father sending off his package, walking out of the post office with his baby in his arms, and a room full of strangers who believed they had just witnessed a moment of deep loss and quiet courage, while the man who had spoken so cruelly disappeared in shame. And maybe now you are asking yourself, was it right? Was it wrong? Or was it simply human? And that is the beauty of stories like this. They leave us thinking. They leave us reflecting on how words can change a situation in an instant. Before we finish, let's pause for a small English practice. Because this channel is not only about stories, it is also about helping you find your voice again. And today I want you to remember one simple phrase, a phrase that can turn away conflict with calm. And the phrase is, I'm sorry, but I'm doing my best. It is gentle, it is clear, and it protects your dignity without attacking anyone. Now, let's practice together. Repeat after me slowly. I'm sorry, but I'm doing my best. One more time, with a more confidence. I'm sorry, but I'm doing my best. Another useful phrase from this story is, what do you want me to do? Simple, direct, and powerful, because sometimes asking this question makes the other person stop and think. So let's say it together now. What do you want me to do? And again, a little louder this time. What do you want me to do? You see, with just a few words, you can change the balance of a conversation. You can shift the mood of the room, and you can stand your ground even when you feel small. So as you finish listening today, remember this lesson, that words are not only sounds, they are power. And with practice, with calm, and with courage, you too can turn the weight of the world back in your favor, one sentence at a time.